So as I said, my name is Anton Goodman, the Director of Partnerships for Rabbis for Human Rights. Tomorrow is the start of our harvesting season. Now, as probably many of you know, the harvesting season isn't decided by the conflict, isn't decided by the Israeli army or even by the Palestinian farmers. It's decided by nature. And we want to respect and give place to that as well, to that kind of life cycle, the nature cycle of this holy land that is going through such a difficult time at the moment. And the olive harvest is now starting. And tomorrow we'll be going out. It's a group of about 25 activists to El Jabba, which is in the Bethlehem region. There's some farmers there, and the town has asked for our help because there's a patch of an orchard of about 200 or grove of about 200 olive trees next to the security barrier that the community is worried they can't get to without our presence and without our help. And we're very happy to be going with them. If you'd like to join us, there's still space on the bus. And so Ezra's just put into the chat now. Thank you, Ezra, the sign-up form to join the olive harvest as an activist. And we'd love to host you there. And this evening, we start our series of trainings, and we're very honored to host Liam Mahony with us. Really a real honor and a privilege. Liam is a protection and human rights advocate, activist with over 40 years of experience in field work, in research and writing and training all over the world. He's at Princeton University. He's the author of several books on protection. And we might put in a couple of links at the end of Liam's talk to some of those which you can find online. And he's worked with Peace Brigades International, Amnesty International, and a range of UN missions. And in our region was a founding consultant on the creation of EAPPI, the ecumenical accompaniment program in Palestine, Israel, run by the World Council of Churches. Liam, it's really fantastic to have you with us. And I'm just going to hand over to you if that's okay.
Sure. Thank you very much. Welcome to everyone. It's a real privilege to be here. I think that the work that you're all engaged in is phenomenally important. And it just, if I can help in any way, I'm thrilled to do it. Just by manner of introduction, I've been working on basically protective presence analysis and action since the 1980s. And I started with Peace Brigades International. And I wrote a book in the 90s called Unarmed Bodyguards, which was about protective accompaniment done by Peace Brigades International. But since then, I expanded to try to basically teach this technique to a lot of different kinds of organizations all over the world. And I did a major study in the 2000s looking at multilateral missions by the UN and other intergovernmental groups that were doing monitoring missions all over the world, and also doing the same use of their presence to try to protect communities where they were monitoring human rights violations and things like that. This included missions in El Salvador, Haiti, Guatemala, Rwanda, Kosovo, East Timor, Nepal, Colombia, Sri Lanka, and also TIP, the temporary international presence in Hebron that had begun in the early 2000s in Hebron. And that led to a book called Proactive Presence, Field Strategies for Civilian Protection, which really tried to draw out the common lessons about how to do this work and good practices from really diverse, different kinds of conflict situations that people were facing. So I'm going to share some slides now and do a presentation, but then there'll be time at the end for any kinds of questions and feedback that any of you have. I really hope that during the presentation, you'll be thinking about your own experiences. I know some of you already have experience doing protective presence with olive harvest and other support to communities in Palestine, and also questions you may have if you don't have this experience. Okay. So first, let's try to share. Find my screen. Tell me if you can see the screen.
We can see it.
Okay, so now I just have to try to actually launch the slideshow. Excuse me. Okay. So I want to give a good background on the history of this tactic of protection and share some examples, but also talk a lot about the logic and why it works. Okay, so what we've seen as to the reasons why having this kind of presence of outsiders in communities that are threatened makes a difference, both for the communities and for the people who are attacking them. Okay, and I want to start it with the description of two essentially concepts that I think are quite important to understand in terms of understanding our impact. One is the concept of impunity and the idea that it has multiple levels. Okay, impunity works both in situations where people's rights are completely denied, like they don't even know they have them. Okay, that happens often in situations like slavery, situations of abuse against women and children, where the entire culture essentially denies that certain categories of people have rights. That's essentially the worst level of impunity. A next level up is that people understand that they have rights, but no one other than those people know that their rights are being abused. The information is being hidden or blocked in a variety of different ways, and the outside world doesn't know about it, so the attackers have impunity. And then the third level is that everybody knows what's happening, but the attackers have enough power that they are never held accountable. Okay, and I think what we have both of these last two situations occurring with Israel and Palestine, in which there are attempts to block information from getting out, but there is also a high level of power that Israel has internationally that prevents accountability. Okay. The second topic I wanted to raise is the impact of long-term terror, because you are definitely in a situation in Palestine where this is a reality, and most of the conflicts I've worked in, it has been a reality. And this is where an attacking force has been using fear and violence for a long time, not just to target and attack individuals, but to use attacks against individuals as signals to threaten entire communities and cause everyone to be fearful and inhibited. And the whole idea of this strategy is that when people are inhibited, they are more passive and they are easier to control. And this is a very well-studied strategy of war. It's psychological warfare. And it works. And basically, people do feel inhibited, people do feel passive, and they need lots of support to overcome those inhibitions, which sometimes our presence can help to bring to them. So when I speak about protection by presence, it's a simple concept with a lot of different ways of doing it, okay? So it's the use of presence, visits, and responses to people who are exposed to violence, just with the objective always of trying to influence the behavior of those who are responsible for the violence, okay? In this case, for instance, you have a picture from Colombia of an Italian accompaniment organization, and they're in a jungle village putting up a poster showing all the armed groups around that area that this community has an international presence inside the community. The idea being to try to influence the group by making sure they know that the accompaniment is happening. We think generally about protective presence as affecting only the attackers in that it deters their actions, and that is one of the primary reasons we do it. It should cause them to rethink their political calculus of what they can get away with because they are being more closely observed, okay? But there's also a very second important, powerful part of our accompaniment, and that is because of this long-term terror that people have lived through, the presence of outside solidarity gives people greater confidence. It just helps them to feel they have a little bit of breathing space, that they can sometimes, because there is external presence with them, they feel that they can work together and do things and try to develop new strategies that when they felt isolated, they didn't feel they could do. And this dynamic of seeing how communities who are accompanied have been able to increase their own activism has been demonstrated all over the world in these situations of accompaniment. The idea of protection by presence is essentially that some people in a given situation are perceived to have a kind of protected status. They are a little more safe than the people who are being attacked. And because we have that protected status, we can use it by being present and sending a signal, and we are a bit safer than the people we are trying to help protect. that status takes a lot of forms. A lot of the groups I've studied have used international citizenship as status. It's international protection. But there's also religious status. Lots of religious organizations have done protection by presence at the national level in their countries. And there's also just status of, in a given country, there are dominant and more powerful ethnicities or subgroups who can protect those who are more threatened. And the example I would give there is that all over, for instance, in North America and Europe, there are movements of citizens who are trying to offer protection with migrant and immigrant populations in their countries who have less power and are less protected. There's also a long history of how wartime journalists, their presence has actually affected the people who are waging war, because when they know that what they're doing is being reported on, they will moderate their behavior to reduce the political costs. We've seen in the field in different countries also that there are certain professions that tend to be highly respected all over the world. So for instance, I've seen many examples where in a given community, the lead teacher of the community or the religious leader of the community or the doctors of the community, they are perceived to have such legitimacy and respect that they're actually able to use their identity to protect others who are perceived to have less power. Okay, so, and in some places you have also state authorities, even when their own state is the one who's violating human rights, you have people within the state who are concerned about this and use the fact that they're a state authority to go out and be present in places where that presence can make a difference. These are all different kinds of use of an identity that's different than the people you're protecting that enables it to be used. So, and what began to happen is that when different people saw that this dynamic existed, they began to create literally rigorous structural, essentially corporate identities of organizations that tried to mobilize this power. Certainly the first was the International Committee for the Red Cross. Starting over 150 years ago, they began to try to develop and successfully develop the idea that the visible presence of their symbol, of their white vehicles with the red crosses and their staff, should be moderating and changing the behavior of the armed actors when they are present. And they have proven this to be the case over a long term. You have another example in the 1950s and 60s in America, where there was a civil rights movement of the Black American population in the South, in which one of their tactics was to invite hundreds and hundreds of white Northern Americans who were in solidarity with them to come down and accompany them in a lot of their struggles and their campaigns as a protection. We began to see at the international level a real explosion of this kind of use of presence in the 1980s with the movements in solidarity with Latin America that grew up in countries all over the world. And so starting in the 80s, we found, as had never actually happened in previous conflicts, that international citizens, thousands and thousands and thousands of them, were going to countries like Nicaragua and El Salvador, Guatemala, Chile, others that were living through military dictatorships and using their presence as protection. And this movement actually led to the formation of one of the first sort of global organizations that tried to mobilize this kind of volunteerism on a global level, which was Peace Brigades International in the 1980s, which now works in several different countries around the world. The other dynamic that happened at the end of the 80s, which is quite interesting, was that large-scale United Nations and other intergovernmental missions recognized that this use of presence has the power to protect people and began to build it into essentially ceasefire monitoring missions and peace monitoring missions. So the first one of these that actively used it was in the late 80s in El Salvador, but we then began to see that the idea that human rights monitoring parts of a peace mission were doing protection by their presence was multiplied in Guatemala, Rwanda, all those countries I mentioned earlier, because the study I did in the 2000s was looking at that whole history of multilateral missions using their presence as protection. And then you have a rich history where you are in Israel and Palestine. I was I was lucky to be asked in early 2000s to help the World Council of Churches in the creation of the Ecumenical Accompaniment Project with what was previously called the Christian Peacemaker Teams, and now the Community Peacemaker Teams, who are in Hebron now. But back in the 90s, they began their work in Haiti, in fact. There's a temporary international presence in Hebron, which is no longer there. And there's all of you and all the work you're doing to do protection by presence. And I'm sure there's more, which you can mention when we get to the discussion. So that's just a bit of the history. I just want to really emphasize for all of you that what you're participating in is actually it has a very respectable history, and it's been proven to work in a really large number of different situations around the world. And what I have found interesting in my studies is that in almost every country I go to study this dynamic, the first thing people say is, well, I'm sorry, but the conflict where we are is very different than all those other conflicts. We're completely unique, and what works somewhere else is not going to work here. That's certainly what I've heard in Israel and Palestine many times. You hear it everywhere. Everyone believes themselves to be unique because, in fact, they are. And so one of the things that I tried to study were what are all the different factors that help to make this tactic work, so that we can see what the difference balance of factors are in different conflicts and how we can use them. Okay. So I wanted to share a few real examples of this work. When I began my work in the 80s in Guatemala, we were accompanying an organization of families of disappeared people during the end of the dictatorship in Guatemala. And this group, all its leaders were just being wiped out systematically. And they came to Peace Brigades International and they said, listen, we're either going to have to shut down or we're going to see if it will work if you are with us. And Peace Brigades International began at that point an incredibly labor-intensive 24-hour-a-day accompaniment of the leadership of this organization in the mid-1980s. And from that point forward, not a single leader was assassinated of that organization. And they went on to become the primary human rights organization in the country and to really lead the movement towards a peace process and change in Guatemala. Part of that change in Guatemala also happened in the 90s, which was that there were 30,000 refugees in Mexico who organized themselves to return to Guatemala, even while there was still conflict. And they did so asking the international community to accompany them. And dozens of small accompaniment organizations popped up all over Europe, North America, Australia, and sent thousands of volunteers over a period of about 5 years to live in dozens of communities of Guatemalan returned refugees. And it was round-the-clock rotating volunteers for years that went on there, and that refugee return was considered to be very successful. And a key part of it was that the refugee communities were so frightened about going back to Guatemala that having this accompaniment enabled them to overcome that fear and go back anyway and prove that it was possible. Okay. In a very different kind of context, which is the war in South Sudan in the 2000s and 2010s, another organization called the Nonviolent Peace Force set up a process of creating teams of both national and international staff to work in isolated violent areas. And what was interesting about that was that at that time, there was a really large peacekeeping operation with armed UN Blue Berets in South Sudan. And there were a lot of territories that the peacekeeping operation, they would never go, not even with their armed soldiers. And they said, these areas are too out of control and too off limits. And the Nonviolent Peace Force actually set up their presence in those areas that were being left out and proved essentially to the UN and the rest of the international community that these areas are not off limits if you just went about it the right way and carefully. And they began accompanying communities in different parts of South Sudan. Another really, I think, moving example I wanted to share came in 2000 when the United Nations was monitoring the referendum that led to the independence of East Timor. And in this case, it was an unarmed monitoring mission, a lot of people, and they had a big UN compound. And at the end of that process, the situation of insecurity broke down so much that thousands of East Timor people were hiding and basically seeking protection inside the UN compound, and they were surrounded by paramilitary thugs who they were terrified of. And in that situation, the UN from New York gave the order to the UN mission to evacuate all the international personnel and leave. And essentially, the head of the mission and all of their staff said to New York, no, there's no way we can leave because all these people will be killed. And they stayed, and they completely changed the UN policy and strategy in that situation by staying and continuing, even when the politics of New York were saying to walk away. So right now, I've been working in the last couple of years with the Norwegian Refugee Council, which has been setting up protection by presence operation in Colombia. We had a really interesting experience just a few weeks ago, where one of our staff was in a community in the jungles in the rural area controlled by an armed group, and he was walking around the village, and a woman invited him into her home and chatted with him and said basically, well, yesterday the guerrillas were here with their weapons, and we told them that you were coming, and they said, oh well, we can't be here then tomorrow, so we'll leave. They got out of the way, and it was an interesting example of where they actually admitted that they were paying attention to the international presence, and they were avoiding it and not wanting to be seen by it. And having studied this dynamic for so long myself, I have to admit, there aren't that many smoking guns where the people who use violence will publicly admit that they are concerned about our presence. It happens once in a while, but mostly we have to use indirect evidence to show that this is true. Okay. So we have to ask ourselves in these situations, why would it work? Why would these people who are using such violence use less violence because we're there? And the logic is basically that they're using violence for a reason. These are strategies. They're doing things, and they're measuring costs and benefits and deciding what they should and shouldn't do. They will use violence if it works for them, and they will use less violence if the violence has too many political costs. They are sensitive to certain kinds of political factors, and we have to try to know what those sensitivities are so that our presence will affect them. Okay. And those, in different conflicts and situations, those sensitivities, they might be global. They might be concerned about what is said about them in the UN or in Brussels or whatever, but they might just be local. They might be very concerned about what the local community is saying about them or what the local priest is saying about them. So there's all different levels of where they have an image issue that they're trying to control. The main dynamics we've seen that lead to their interest in controlling their behavior when they're being watched, essentially, is political reputation. The leaders and the movements, they are always trying to create an image for themselves. Sometimes they have a terrible reputation, but even in those situations, they try to create a situation in which their image is better than their opponent. So no matter the number of times where you see one armed actor basically advertising the bad things that their enemy armed actor has done and trying to say, well, they're the terrorists, we're the good guys, is a very common dynamic. And because they all have that dynamic, they actually therefore are less interested in having outsiders see the violence that they do. Okay. In some settings, there's very direct political and economic benefits that come with having a good international image or a good national image and not being observed doing war crimes, for instance. And some of those benefits are things that they hope they will get later out of peace negotiations. We've seen situations in which, for instance, armed group leaders are aware that some of them are going to be scapegoated and called war criminals, and those are the ones who are going to get less benefits out of the peace process later. They will be pushed aside, and the people who have a somewhat more moderate image are more likely to get a benefit from it. At the extreme level of that, there would be the risk of legal prosecution after a peace process happens or after some change in the situation happens. But one of the more common dynamics we've seen about costs that people are concerned about is simply what their superior officers are going to think of them. I had a really fascinating conversation years ago with a high-level authority in Sri Lanka, who is actually quite a terrible man, who had essentially helped his government organize massive violence and massacres during a war in the early 1990s there. And I asked him, I said, when I was writing my first book, I asked him, well, listen, I understand why someone like you who understands international dynamics, I see why you might see that an international presence represents some political cost. But what about some stupid thug or police officer out in a small town, and he sees us come up as an international presence? Why would he care that we're there? What difference does it make? He doesn't understand the politics of presence and the politics of international pressure. And this guy, who was very smart, he said, no, you're right. He doesn't understand that at all. But you know what he understands? And you know who he's most afraid of? He is way more afraid of his superior officer than anyone else in the world. And when an outside player comes into the scene, he does not know what of his behavior is going to be reported to his superiors and how it might affect him. And he will tend to be very careful because of that uncertainty. So that was a very interesting dynamic to be made aware of, that our presence actually causes uncertainty for people who are using violence because they don't exactly know what the political costs might be to being watched. There's also, beyond direct costs that people may perceive, there's also just norms and attitudes that really affect how they see us. So in some conflicts we've been, for instance, the armed actors, they have ideological commitments and alliances. They try to present themselves, for instance, as Marxist saviors of the people, or in the case of a lot of the Latin American organizations, for instance, they're all Catholics. They all are linked to the church and to priests and things like that. And these are all things that they are trying to present themselves as having allies and ideologies that are pro-people. And therefore, when they're actually behaving in the opposite fashion, it creates a contradiction. We've also seen that in lots of countries, there's pride and nationalism, which is, and what it essentially leads to is that people don't actually like for an outsider to come in and see the ugly side of what's going on in their country. And they will try to sort of hide that from a visitor or someone who's watching. And it's part of it is, it's not just assessing political cost, it's also just nationalistic pride. Like they're a little embarrassed about it and they will hide it, okay? A third cultural dynamic that I've seen in every country I've worked in is that there are widespread cultures of hospitality about respecting visitors, okay? Almost every culture, you know, if you walk in to a community and you're an outsider, the first thing you're going to be offered is a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. You're not going to be screamed at. It's like there are cultures of hospitality all over the world, and these actually affect how they treat outside presence. Okay? And then finally, we have to respect that all the people who are carrying out violence, they're still just people. They're still actually in some way trying to come up with some kind of moral justification for their behavior. And these can affect how they behave when they're being watched. And also, if we treat them as moral people and moral individuals, they're actually more likely to sort of moderate their behavior to try to justify their own morality in some way, okay? And all of these are different factors that affect why this dynamic of presence might work. And the balance of these factors will be different in one conflict, in one setting, in one situation, or even from one day to the next. But we want to be thinking about them when we're out there and thinking, well, how does our behavior help or affect what's going on in the head of the person who's using violence? In what way do we want our behavior to make them think twice? And we want it to make them think twice in every way possible. We want them to be embarrassed morally. We want them to feel like they're embarrassing their culture. We want them to feel like they're going to suffer, somebody's going to yell at them from above. Anything that we can project of legitimacy that makes them think that our presence should convince them to change what they're doing, we want to play upon. And so we want to try to analyze these kinds of dynamics for the people who are using violence where we do this work. The next thing I wanted to address is essentially the structure of violence. I mean, in every situation, we have someone who's hurting someone else, right? But usually that perpetrator is part of a system where there are decision makers at the top who are deciding about a strategy of violence. And between those decision makers and the perpetrator, there is some kind of chain of command. And what we see in all these conflicts is that that chain of command, it might be very strict and very clear, like certain military institutions, or it might be extremely fuzzy and hard to track, okay, where we don't actually know who's giving the orders or what people those orders are passing through that are allowing this violence to happen, right? Now, when we put a protective presence into this situation, essentially what we aim to do is for that presence to be visible not only to the perpetrator who may be hurting a civilian, but to the other different actors in that chain of command, so that there's some kind of flow of information between the act on the ground and the high-level decision makers, and that our presence is promoting some kind of discussion there where they're saying, well, wait a minute, maybe we should take into account that there's someone there this week and behave differently. And that isn't necessarily a decision that the perpetrator who's got the baseball bat or the gun has the power to make. You have to be present in a way that is transparently visible to the other decision makers in that structure. Otherwise, you won't have that impact. And at the same time, what we found with international presence is that having a monitoring mission or even just a few international volunteers on the ground also tends to create a greater level of international pressure on the situation. And the reason being that essentially governments and missions and embassies tend to be more concerned about what is happening when they have their own citizens at risk on the ground. Okay. Now, technically or logistically, protection by presence tends to work at different levels. Big organizations can, for instance, be physically visible with sub-offices and an institutional presence in rural areas or in smaller towns or larger towns. A lot of organizations do patrols and rural visits where they just have a regular process of making sure that the community knows they are coming, they will come back, that they know if something happens in between their visits, it will be reported on anyway because everyone knows they're coming back. So having a sort of cycle of patrols is another common tactic. And then finally, direct accompaniment, being with people either constantly or at the specific moments when you expect they are at most risk, such as what you are planning now with the olive harvest. Okay. What we've tried to outline in a lot of the analysis of these situations is the idea that the person who commits violence is part of a network. Okay, and there are a lot of different people who can influence that person. And what we want, ideally, what you have with protective presence is that it works in parallel with some level of advocacy and transparent communication. Advocacy and transparent communication, which basically is trying to make sure that the person who uses violence is not only seeing you on the ground, but is also getting some kind of message from other actors saying, you know, hey, you should lay off while this is happening. You should not behave badly while they're watching. And that information, what we've seen is that sometimes that information is very vertical, like superior officers, but sometimes it is much more social. People are hearing it literally from their priests and their mothers and their business associates that what they're doing is an embarrassment to the community or things like that. So you want to be trying to promote a kind of legitimate image that enables that kind of messaging to be happening to the people who use violence. And then one of the final points I want to make is that in every situation I've ever worked, I think one of the things we should be really, really conscious of is that we who come in as outsiders to offer temporary protection are a very small piece of the protection puzzle. And most protection that goes on, people are doing it for themselves. Their communities are doing it, protecting each other. Their community leaders are doing it, their local religious leaders. It's a very much, we are an add-on, essentially complementing a protection picture that they are trying to develop for themselves. And we therefore have to be extremely respectful and careful that when we go into communities, we are doing things in such a way that our presence is not replacing things that they would do, but adding to it and assisting it, and that we are not doing any harm by getting in the way of their own strategies, okay? So I'll end with a few summary of some of the lessons learned from all these different experiences that I've had the chance to work with, okay? One is, one should always do accompaniment with very clear petitions from the people who are to be helped, okay? That you should actually do analysis together with them of why your accompaniment will work and have their analysis of what the threats are. And you never go if they don't want you there. That should be really obvious, but it sometimes isn't because there isn't that communication. Second, you should always have very clear security procedures as an organization and try to have unity and coherence in that process. And within that, you should really know your limits and when you have to not go places or pull away from situations, okay? Third, as I mentioned, you should try to always project an image of legitimacy and legality and humanity, that we're not anyone's enemy. And the reason that is helpful is because it makes it harder to dismiss us. It makes it harder to say, oh, those are just thugs or assholes who come to yell at us and judge us. And it makes it easier, therefore, for moderate voices in their own structure to say, hey, wait a minute, you know, these are not violent people, these are not thugs, these are people that if we don't respect them, it's going to cost us. Okay, and the more we project that image, the better. Okay. As I mentioned before, the more there's a combination of strategies of presence and advocacy so that the actors using violence get multiple messages, the better. Next is that in preparation for this work, we found it's really helpful to talk through all the scenarios that we can think of as to what might happen and try to practice what the responses will be. You can always expect the unexpected. You can expect provocations. You can expect certain kinds of violence that are at a level that you're willing to deal with and stay on with, and others that you might need to leave for. But you need to think about them in advance and plan together. Okay. And you need to have response plans for how you deal with when you are harassed. Harassing people who do this work is a very common dynamic, and it happens in different ways. It can happen on the spot where you're just yelled at and told to get out, but it can also happen in which your organizations are vilified or delegitimized publicly or on social media, in which essentially the movement is being harassed. And you need to have response plans and know how you're going to strengthen your legitimacy when that's happening. And then finally, a process of accompaniment by what I would call sort of normal citizens is very powerful, but it also helps if you're at the same time trying to encourage other sort of VIP presence to also be present in these situations. And here, you know, you're talking about political and religious and even cultural leaders in the country or international actors or embassies or things like that. The more there is a presence that is kind of showing multiple sources of power that complement each other, the more you can get done with your presence. So I will share this whole presentation with everyone. These are a couple of the resources that I've written, but there are others too that you can find on this work. This work has really ballooned since I started doing it in the 1980s. Now, there's lots of organizations that do protection by presence in different conflicts, okay? And I thank you all for listening. I'd really love to hear now your own thoughts, your experiences, and I will stop sharing the screen so we can see each other better.
Thank you so much, Liam, for that really quite inspirational talk. And I think for many of us, it probably certain parts resonated deeply, and other parts we might have questions on. And so we're going to open the floor to questions. I'm actually going to kick off to get the ball moving. And the question I have is on your slide of the chain of command, which I think is, you know, everything that you said about people working within networks and within commands, I think that is something that we see on the ground. However, in your chain of command, the top level is the decision makers who have who are disincentivized because they want to have a positive international image, or they don't want the international image to be tarnished. Now, we're struggling with the situation here since November 2022, or more specifically, since this new government was formed, that we have a number of senior ministers who have been very visible in extremist settler violence throughout the years. And now they're holding positions of power, and it's quite clear they don't have any problem with having a negative international image. If anything, it's helping them in the polls. And so the question that I'd like to start off with you is, what happens when you don't have that disincentivization around a positive international image? What happens when at the top of the chain of command, you have decision makers who are actively leveraging the fact that they have a bad international image?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great question. It's certainly not the only context where we've seen this happen. I would make two answers to that. One is, I think you always have to be using multiple sources of power and multiple lines of how to convince people to change what they're doing. And in this case, I think what you all represent is quite unique, because you don't represent international power. You represent these Israeli citizens. And that is a different sort of line of communication to the people in power, which is the fact we found in many situations that leaders are far more concerned about about the management of their politics of their own population than they are about what the international community thinks of them. They're quite willing to dismiss the international community, but they still want to win the next election, and they are still sort of trying to make sure that they have an image of legitimacy with their own population. So to whatever extent your movement can sort of, in some small way, eat away at the legitimacy that this kind of behavior has within Israeli society is very, very important, because international actors can't do that, and you possibly can. But the second thing is that this disincentivization at the international level, I mean, it's always very relative, because basically you could almost always say with Israel that there's not a lot of incentive, because they have the US's support apparently no matter what they do for the last decades and decades, right? And yet, if you watch Israel's behavior all around the world, they are one of the most paranoid countries about their image that I've ever seen. They watch everything everyone says about them. I mean, if I say something publicly about Israel in America, believe me, I will be rapidly labeled an anti-Semite and vilified and attacked. And this happens all over the world. It's quite fascinating that the amount of concern they have about their image does suggest that they are still somewhat sensitive, even though a lot of this behavior at the top level and the public behavior suggests otherwise. Okay, so I think both dynamics are happening at the same time, and we just have to keep looking for ways to grow that pressure at the international level, but while also seeking these alternative channels at the domestic level for having influence.
Thank you, Liam. That's very helpful, and you're correct that it's not a hegemony, the Israeli establishment, of not caring about international opinion, and there still remains those who do care very much about it. And we've been working with quite a large group of international diplomats in Israel and Palestine to be supporting these efforts from the advocacy level. If anyone's got a question or a comment that they'd like to share, because we'd like to open this up, you get the opportunity to speak with Liam a little bit, please raise your hand within the Zoom chat, and we'll hand across to you. The raised hand can be found in reactions, I think, if you're wondering. Or you can actually raise your hand physically as well.
Actually, perhaps I might ask a question, though, because I find that one of the unique things about the situation you're in is this sort of connected but dual sources of violence, because you have Israeli security forces and you have settlers, and their structure. When we talk again about this chain of command, their structure is different, and it's fairly straightforward in most situations I've been in to communicate restraint, to communicate what we stand for to an official government body like the military. But what I wonder about is, what are your options for communicating through the political movement that the settlers are? Okay, because it's sometimes it's sometimes too easy to just dismiss that, oh, we just have raving young men, lunatics up on the hills who are firing guns, because that's not what's happening. It's a very organized movement. Therefore, it must be linked all the way through Israeli society, and there must be channels. And I wonder how you find them and use them.
Yeah, and I think Liam, there was just a question that came up from someone whose name says K. That's I think very related to this. They're asking whether you think that we can try to project a good moral image upon the settlers or the army while we are already seen as people who oppose the whole prospect of the occupation, meaning they already know we are their enemies. So I think this relates to when you're talking about how it's important to try to be seen as sort of an impartial arbiter. But the problem is there's already a very, very strong system, like institutional system, that has already assigned a side to us. So it makes it very difficult.
Mm-hmm. But I guess the question is, how do you moderate that perception through other actors within the settler community? I mean, I think I have already, heard that, there are certainly, in any situation like this, for instance, you will always find the number of people who use violence actively are actually always a very small minority of the structure and the population that you're dealing with. Okay, so that means there's a whole lot of people in this movement who are not actively using violence and who may have a whole spectrum of opinions about how much violence is being used. Only we don't necessarily have access to them or access to knowing who are our potential allies in that movement. So yes, there are some people who have defined you as their enemy, but it's not black and white, because they define you as their enemy, and that doesn't mean they walk out there with a submachine gun and mow you down, because they still know that you represent some portion of Israeli citizenship, and that you represent something that could potentially have an impact politically, and therefore that's what you want to emphasize, and that's what you want them to be thinking. And so, I mean, I would go back to the example I shared about white Northern Americans who went to the South during the Civil Rights Movement in the 50s and 60s in America. And believe me, for Southern white racists, those white North Americans were absolutely the enemy. They thought they were just traitors to the race, right? But most of the time, their presence still worked because they were white citizens who represented the mainstream of the country. So it was far less easy to attack them. And I would assume, and although you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume that in your experiences doing this accompaniment, you find over and over again that it's much easier for settlers to attack Palestinians.
Yeah, I think I have found that. Another question that I have that I just thought of was also there's an issue around engaging with settlers in the army, especially when we're in the communities that we work with, because the nature of the occupation has created this atmosphere of intense distrust and insularity among Palestinian communities, just because they have to be very careful with who they, especially if you're Israeli, with who they're engaging with, because that can have very real, serious repercussions. And I know of a few instances where activists on the ground who have tried to negotiate with the army or the settlers in the wrong way, or they're too friendly, and it actually damages the relationships that we have with the community. I don't know if there's any basis for going about navigating that from other contexts that you can maybe help us with.
Well, I mean, it goes back to one of the early points I made that you in the good practice list, which is that you need the idea that you sit down and you do analysis together with your Palestinian hosts is absolutely crucial, because if you're going to talk to authorities, they need to know what you're going to say and that it's okay. And that it needs to be essentially a joint strategy so that you're not undermining them. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that it's that you're completely powerless about that strategy. It actually should be joint. You should be talking with them about, well, here's what we could say, and maybe it would help, and what are the possibilities. And I would share one example in my experience was when we were sitting together with the World Council of Churches back in the early 2000s and the creation of the Ecumenical Accompaniment Pratica Palestine and Israel. And the hosts in Palestine for that are the Palestinian Christian churches. So there were a lot of Palestinian representatives from those churches in this conference that created it. And I made the analysis. I said, well, if you're going to have this presence, your best impact is if you are not only talking to Palestinians, but that you have a presence in Tel Aviv that's talking to the Israeli authorities. And the initial reaction of the Palestinian leaders there was absolutely not. They didn't want anyone talking to the Israeli authorities. So it was a very difficult challenge to overcome. And we've seen that in other countries as well, which is that there are trust issues, not just between the attacked group and the authorities, but trust issues towards us as outsiders as to whether we can represent them correctly and do it correctly. On the other hand, they also know that sometimes we as outsiders have access to talk to people that they are blocked from. Okay, so, it is certainly the case that if you want to talk to the Israeli military, there are certain actors in the state or in the international community that have the ability to do it, whereas any local Palestinian leader does not. They're not going to answer their phone call. So sometimes there's a collaboration there that you can try to develop, but it does have to be a collaboration.
Thank you, Liam. And I'll just point out that all of the olive harvesting activities that we're running this season and have run for the last 20 years are always in coordination with the Palestinian city councils and the farmers. And this year, even on the level of governors of regions who know that we're coming. And so that collaboration does exist. And I see that Tanya has her hand up. So please unmute yourself and you can ask a question.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Lovely. I love everything you said, Liam. Thank you so much. I'm based in the Jordan Valley at the moment. And my question is, in your community presence work, have you ever come across situations where there are repercussions on the fragile communities and people are threatened with violence if they see internationals or if they see internationals coming and supporting them? And how would you address that?
Yeah, it's actually quite common because in most cases, the international presence is not 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it doesn't just stay there. It comes and it goes, right? And so you have a lot of situations where it will come and then it will go. And then the next day, the armed actor comes into town and says, why did you talk to those people? What did you say to those people? And harasses them for that process. And this is a very important dynamic, again, for that joint analysis together with the local community leaders, because basically they have to decide whether they think that the ongoing protection that your temporary visit offers is worth that risk. Because we've had a lot of situations, for instance, this happens in Colombia with armed groups in the rural areas all the time, where they will basically say, well, yes, they are going to come after you leave, and they're going to ask us all about this. But they still know that you were just there and you're coming back, and they are less likely to hurt us because of that. So we will take that risk. We will deal with that interrogation because we're actually still safer because of that ongoing commitment of solidarity from your side. So that's not our decision to make. And we need to talk to them and make sure that they're balancing it themselves and deciding when they want us and when they don't. And I think one of the challenges that raises for us in this work is that we should never raise false expectations as to what we're capable of doing, okay? Because you can't leave a community thinking you're going to be back every day or every week if you're not going to be back for months. And you have to be very, very clear that of what your limits are. We can do just this much, and you have to tell us if just this much is worth troubling you with.
Thank you very much, Liam.
I notice another hand up, but I can't read the name. So.
Yeah, I see. I think that yeah, I think it's Ilana. There we go. I'm going to ask you to unmute Ilana. Not yet. Try again. There you go.
Thank you. I'm sorry. First of all, thank you for putting things in order. I've been many, many years in the olive harvest picking activities with the rabbis and many organizations. And I'm rather concerned now because of what happened last October, which was together with the beginning of this war, that we literally, I can say, couldn't get in. One or two cases I won't even mention, and it was like just a few people we somehow got in, and in the end, they got us out. So my concern is the war is still going on, and I'm thinking of if we should think of tactics or strategies of, let's say we literally can't really go and help with the olive picking for the Palestinians. Can we do something else, or do we go home and don't go and you know, the activity is canceled for that day? So I don't have ideas, but maybe you can say something, or other people maybe can say something.
Mhm.
Do you want me to field that, Liam? Because it's rather conflict specific.
Yeah, I mean, and then I do have a reflection, so go ahead first, please.
I'll say just very practical statements, and then we'd love to hear your insight. Ilana, last year as well, we also faced those problems. And there was only 8 days when we got out to the field and were able to help Palestinian farmers reach their olive trees. And as we know, last year, there was a massive loss of crop. There was a loss of life. And there was a massive loss through vandalism and attacks on the trees themselves. Last year, 10,000 trees were burned by extremist settlers. This year, we have scheduled with communities every day from the 10th of October until the 8th of November. And we're coming into it as a little bit of an unknown. And we'll be speaking about this later in our security session, because this is the first year, maybe in 20 years, that the Israeli army hasn't issued orders or delineated territories for where the harvest can happen and when it can happen. The only dates that have been spoken about are from late October after the Jewish festivals, which is very late in the season. Legally, that means that Palestinians have the right, actually, to pick where on their own land, wherever they are. And that seems to be a positive implication, but as we know, the reality on the ground doesn't always follow the legal precedents. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing along with a number of organizations, doing a first week of harvesting that's really checking in different places across the West Bank, from the South Hebron Hills, the Bethlehem area, to the Nablus region. Those are 3 of the places we're focusing in the first week to get an understanding of what's going on the ground. But we definitely don't think it will be impossible to do the olive harvest. What we really need are the numbers of activists to be joining us on the ground in order to be showing that this is important. Liam, you want to take it away?
Yeah, well, there were two thoughts that occurred to me about that situation, which is, I mentioned earlier that, I mean, being blocked from getting in is a kind of harassment, and the idea that we need to have strategies for responding to harassment and being ready for it. And one possibility is to consider how in your initial forays out into these regions you can use or bring in allies who are sort of more VIPs, and who blocking them would have a greater political cost than just every average citizen. Okay, so whether that's an ambassador or anything you can think of that creates more of a political cost to be blocked. But the second thing is to have a planned reaction. I'll share an example. I had a fascinating experience working long ago with a Serbian student movement under Milosevic, and they were running into a situation where every time they did a protest, there were these mass arrests, and the arrests were basically threatening their protest. People were getting afraid to go to the protests. And they instead, what they did was they designed what they called a Plan B. And what it was they would have a protest, and they would already plan a second protest. And the second protest was always going to be right at the police station where the arrested people were brought. And the protest began even before they got there, so that it became such a hassle to the police to arrest all these people because they knew they would then be bringing the protest right to their front door. But this took advanced planning. It wasn't like they got to this event and they said, oh no, they've arrested people. What do we do now? This was like they said to themselves, they're going to arrest people and we're going to have this next plan ready to launch into action immediately. And I think the more that you have essentially a visible public response that represents some sort of political cost to them if they block your access to the olive harvest, and that you're ready to launch that the minute it happens and say, they have just blocked us, this is, not legal, blah, blah. I mean, you have your legal experts who can make some kind of public argument about it and have that ready. So it's not, and be ready every single time so that it's not, so that basically it becomes costly to them to do that to us. That's just some thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liam. I see that there's a couple of questions more from the mysterious Kay. Okay, if you wanted to to open your camera to ask, that would be great as well. But let's take the first one, which I think is something that we experience a lot, which how should we navigate the fact that different Palestinian communities have completely different approaches? We could give the example, for instance, we have protective presence in El Khia, which is in the South Hebron Hills. And the El Khia community there's many highly educated activists among the Palestinian community there who are really got their finger on the pulse and have strategies in place already. Compared to a community in the northern Jordan Valley where we work, where it's a much more simple farming, shepherding community who are really caught between a rock and a hard place and maybe not so media savvy or activists, and they have different approaches to how they would like to deal with the violence they're experiencing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it comes back to the same thing. You just have to sit down with these leaders and map out what you're going to do in each case differently, because you need to be in sync with their approach. And if these are different from place to place, then you have to be ready to have your approach be somewhat different according to what they need. I think one thing you've raised, though, is this difference between a community that is very well informed and well organized and has its own analysis, and a community that might not be. And we run across this all over the world, which is there are some communities who they don't necessarily have the best leaders or the most well-informed population. They aren't necessarily ready to do their own analysis of a risk analysis of what's going on. And some are and some aren't. And the communities that are less prepared, that's a little more uncertain for us, a little more dangerous for us in a sense, because not only because we don't know for sure what the risks are because they don't have their finger on the pulse quite as well as another community, but also because we're at greater risk of doing something that might hurt that community because they're not able to set the limits. They're not able to basically tell us, don't do this and don't do that because they don't have strong enough leadership. So it's good to be, honestly aware of these distinctions and try to be as sensitive to them as we can.
Wonderful. Well, this was a really enlightening session, and I feel like we could schedule to talk again and get even deeper insights. We're going to send this recording out to all those who signed up so you can watch it again and have a look at it. I'm going to put in the chat once more the sign up for the olive harvest. We want to be clear that the majority of the days on the olive harvest, what we're expecting is to have quiet days where our presence enables Palestinian farmers to reach their olive trees, moments of partnership and connection between, Jews, internationals, Israelis, Palestinians, with this very clear intentionality that we come with of wanting to help a community who are facing a human rights abuse. And we would very much like for you to join us. Now, this evening, we're going to be carrying on with the number of sessions. At 7:30, we have Nicola and Amar from the United Nations Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. based in the territories, who are going to be talking about settler violence at the moment and protecting presence from a West Bank perspective. And then I think at night at 8 o'clock, at 8 o'clock, we're going to be having our main training with security procedures and overall our plans for the olive harvest, and we'd love you to join for that. But at this point, I'd like to thank Liam very much for taking the time to educate us, to share your experience from around the world. I think that it's really important for us to see that we're part of something that isn't just this unique, horrible conflict, but we're part of dealing with a human condition that needs to be addressed. And I want to bring the Jewish values here of the sanctity of all human life, of the search and the struggle for equality, peace, and partnership. And may this come about through our work. Thank you, Liam, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.